Almost everything you've been taught about sex is a lie. They've stripped it of its true power, reduced it to either shameful sin or cheap entertainment. But sex was never meant to be just physical. Long before modern religions, before governments and corporations, before the systems that control us were even conceived, ancient spiritual traditions knew something far more profound. They understood that sexual energy is not simply an act of pleasure, but a ikiai, a powerful force capable of unlocking the highest states of consciousness. A sacred technology buried under centuries of manipulation and suppression. Because when you control a person's relationship with their own life force, you control their mind, their emotions, and ultimately, their freedom. The most dangerous thing you can do in today's world is reclaim that power. And once you see how deep the manipulation goes, you can never unsee it. This is the full story of sex and spirituality that every spiritual seeker must finally understand. Part 1. The foundations of control. The conditioning begins. Shame and commodification. From the moment you were old enough to ask questions, the conditioning began. Sex was a topic wrapped in silence, discomfort, or outright shame. Your parents, teachers, and community weren't malicious. They were simply repeating the same scripts fed to them. They, too, were victims of a system that has long understood the power of sexual energy, and even more importantly, the danger of fully realizing it. Early on, you were taught that sex was something to fear, something dirty or sinful, an act that belonged behind closed doors, spoken of only in hushed tones. And yet, paradoxically, everywhere you looked, sex was being sold through television, advertising, and media, cheapened into a commodity, an object of consumption, stripped entirely of its sacred essence. You were trained to associate sex with desire, not with divinity, with lust, not with transcendence, with physical release, not with spiritual awakening. Religion's role in repression. Religions were among the first to seize control of the sexual narrative. Ancient teachings that once honored sexual union as a pathway to the divine were rewritten to fit dogmas of guilt and repression. Entire doctrines were built around the idea that suppressing sexual urges was a measure of morality, a sign of discipline, a requirement for purity. But what was never told is that repression of sexual energy doesn't neutralize it. It oscillates and distorts. Suppressed desire doesn't disappear. It festers. It twists. It grows in unhealthy ways. And those distortions are exactly what the system feeds on. A sexually repressed population becomes easier to control, easier to manipulate, and easier to pacify. Media's weaponization of desire. As you grew older, this conditioning only deepened. The media took over where religion left off, dangling hypersexualized imagery everywhere. Commercials, movies, music videos, all weaponizing sex to sell something, to hijack attention, to trap you in endless cycles of craving and consumption. But even as sexual imagery was paraded, the spiritual essence remained absent. You were programmed to chase pleasure but never fulfillment, to desire bodies but never deep union, to feed cravings that could never fully satisfy, ensuring a loyal, distracted consumer. The lost spiritual fuel. What was never wanted to discover is that sexual energy is not just about biology. It's the most potent spiritual fuel, sex. It's life force itself, the raw creative energy that flows through the universe, animates your being, and connects you to the divine. In ancient spiritual traditions, sexual energy was honored, cultivated, and transmuted into higher states of awareness. The act of sex wasn't seen as sinful. It was sacred. A portal through which human consciousness could transcend physical limitations and merge with higher realms. But this was never taught. Instead, you were taught to fear your own power, and the deeper the disconnection from sexual spiritual energy, the more easily control could be exerted. A person cut off from their own source of vitality becomes docile, anxious, and dependent. They seek fulfillment outside of themselves, looking for answers in religion, in products, in entertainment, in substances, always chasing, but never arriving. Because the one thing that could truly reconnect you to full power, the sacred understanding of sexual energy, had been buried beneath layers of shame and misinformation. The insidious disconnection. What's most insidious is that this disconnection is so deeply embedded into culture that it feels normal. Entire generations grow up believing that sex is either something to be suppressed or something to be consumed, but never something to be revered. And so the cycle continues. The spiritual potential of sexual energy remains hidden in plain sight, dismissed as taboo or fantasy. While humanity stumbles in the dark, chasing fleeting pleasures and wondering why true fulfillment feels forever out of reach. But once the layers begin to peel back, once questioning why the relationship with sex has been shaped this way begins, the cracks in the system become visible. It becomes clear that this was never about protecting morality or preserving purity. This was about control. Because a person who understands and harnesses their own sexual energy becomes dangerously sovereign. They stop seeking validation from external sources. They stop chasing empty pleasures. They become whole, and that kind of individual doesn't fit neatly into a system designed to profit from disconnection. The suppression of sacred sexuality is not accidental. It is deliberate. It is one of the most powerful control mechanisms ever designed, but it doesn't have to be permanent. Because awareness is the first crack in the illusion, and once it's seen, it cannot be unseen. Part 2. The Ancient Wisdom and Modern Manipulation. The Unveiling of Ancient Truths. Long before modern society twisted the meaning of sex into something either shameful or transactional, ancient cultures understood its true nature. They didn't view sexual energy as a dangerous temptation or a commodity to be sold. They saw it as sacred, as divine, as a living, breathing current that could awaken higher states of consciousness and connect the human soul to the very fabric of the cosmos. These were not wild fantasies or primitive myths. They were sophisticated spiritual systems grounded in thousands of years of experiential wisdom, passed down through mystery schools, secret societies, and oral traditions that dared to preserve the truth when the rest of the world descended into repression. Tantra, Daoism, and Egyptian mysteries. In the tantric traditions of ancient India, sex was never just about pleasure. It was a practice of transcendence. The union of masculine and feminine energies wasn't simply physical. It mirrored the cosmic balance of Shiva and Shakti, the dance of stillness and movement, consciousness and creation. Through sacred sexual union, practitioners sought to dissolve the illusion of separation, allowing their individual selves to merge into the divine whole. Every breath, every movement, every gaze was an act of worship, a meditation, a bridge between the material and the spiritual. Sexual energy was seen as the coiled serpent waiting to rise, not as something to be feared or hidden, but as something to be mastered, honored, and elevated. The Daoists, in ancient China, held similar understandings. They studied sexual energy as a force of vitality, longevity, and enlightenment. The practices of Taoist sexual alchemy weren't created for indulgence, but for balance and spiritual growth. By circulating sexual energy through the body, practitioners aim to nourish their internal organs, balance yin and yang energies, and cultivate what they call jing, the essence of life itself. For them, sexual union was not a means to exhaust energy, but to generate and refine it. The goal was not to lose energy through shallow release, but to transmute it into higher consciousness, better health, and even immortality. In Egypt, the mysteries of sacred sexuality were guarded within priesthoods and temples, encoded in hieroglyphs and rituals that outsiders could barely decipher. The union of Isis and Osiris was more than mythology. It represented the merging of polarities, the rebirth of consciousness, and the cyclical nature of divine creation. Sexual rites were performed not as acts of carnal indulgence, but as ceremonies to honor the regenerative powers of life and death, masculine and feminine, matter and spirit. These initiations allowed initiates to experience temporary dissolution of the self, glimpsing realities far beyond the limits of ordinary perception. Gnostic teachings whispered similar truths, portraying the physical world as a reflection of divine principles. For them, sexuality was not sinful, but a pathway back to unity with the divine source, a way to transcend the material illusion and reunite with ultimate truth. Even in some early Christian sects, before the church crushed their teachings, there were echoes of this sacred understanding of union, the suppression and its purpose. Long before celibacy became a weapon of moral control, these ancient traditions were not ignorant or naive. They recognized what modern society has chosen to forget, that sexual energy is life force itself, the same energy that creates life, sustains vitality, fuels creativity, and awakens higher states of awareness. They understood that to master this energy was to hold a key to personal sovereignty, profound intimacy, and spiritual transcendence. But as these teachings spread, they became dangerous to the rising systems of control. Because a population empowered by their own life force is not easily ruled. People cannot be controlled who no longer need external validation, who no longer fear their own desires, who no longer depend on authority to dictate what is moral and what is sinful. A spiritually awakened society cannot be manipulated through shame, guilt, or manufactured desires, and so these teachings were systematically buried. The temples were destroyed, the priesthoods dismantled, the mysteries scattered, their remnants only surviving in esoteric circles, coded texts, and whispered traditions. What remains today are fragments, tiny glimpses of what once was a profound and powerful body of knowledge. Tantra reduced to exoticized fantasies, Daoist sexual practices dismissed as superstition, the Gnostic texts labeled heretical, the Egyptian mysteries lost in translation. But despite centuries of suppression, the knowledge has not been lost entirely. It survives because truth cannot be completely extinguished. It waits in the shadows, ready to be rediscovered by those courageous enough to question the narrative and seek what lies beyond the surface. The tragedy is that most people today still live trapped within the programmed misunderstanding of their own sexual energy. They have been robbed of the wisdom that could have transformed their lives, their relationships, and their spiritual journeys. But once connection with these ancient truths begins, the illusion starts to crumble. It becomes clear that the most powerful key to awakening has been present all along, and the moment it's dared to be reclaimed, everything changes. Part 3. The mechanisms of disconnection. Who benefits from disconnection? If sexual energy holds such immense spiritual potential, then the question must be asked, who benefits from your disconnection? Why would such a profound source of empowerment be turned into a source of shame, fear, and endless distraction? The answer is as unsettling as it is simple: control. When something as fundamental as one's own life force is suppressed or distorted, it doesn't just weaken an individual's confidence or vitality, it severs their connection to themselves. And when people are disconnected from themselves, they become far easier to manipulate, to pacify, and to exploit. Religion's psychological warfare. Religions, long before corporations took over, were among the first to realize this. The more people are shamed for their desires, the more they look to external authorities for guidance, for forgiveness, for redemption. When a person is taught that their own natural urges are sinful, they begin to distrust their own instincts, their own bodies, their own inner voice. And in that vacuum of self-distrust, the institution inserts itself as the gatekeeper of morality. The church, the priesthood, the doctrine, all become necessary intermediaries between one and their own humanity. This is not spirituality. This is psychological warfare, advertising and entertainment's empty promises. But religion was only the first layer. As society evolved, new systems rose that found even more profitable ways to weaponize sexual energy. The advertising industry discovered that nothing grabs attention and sells products like sex, but not sacred sex, not empowered sex. No, what sells is distorted sex, unrealistic, objectified, shallow images designed to trigger endless desire while offering no true fulfillment. Idealized bodies are dangled, implying that if a product is bought, certain clothes are worn, or a specific car is driven, then perhaps one will finally be worthy of desire. But of course, the bar keeps moving. The goal is never to satisfy. It's to keep one craving. Because craving is profitable. Meanwhile, the entertainment industry feeds stories that program understanding of relationships, intimacy, and love itself. You are taught to chase fantasies that don't exist, to measure worth by superficial standards, and to fear authentic vulnerability. The subtle message is always the same. Sex is about performance, about conquest, about validation from others. The sacred aspect, the deep union, the transcendence, the spiritual merging, is entirely absent. And as these narratives are absorbed, expectations become warped. Real intimacy begins to feel foreign, even uncomfortable. One remains trapped, always seeking, never arriving. Pornography, the ultimate weapon. Pornography, perhaps more than any other modern invention, has become the most insidious weapon in this campaign. It offers an endless supply of empty stimulation, bypassing the need for real connection or emotional intimacy. It floods the brain with dopamine, rewiring reward systems, creating patterns of addiction that are incredibly difficult to break. Each click, each view reinforces the cycle. Instant gratification followed by emptiness, followed by more craving. Over time, this constant bombardment desensitizes, numbs, and fragments the ability to experience true intimacy. People begin to see others as objects, not as sacred mirrors of the divine. The purpose, distraction, and dependency. But here's the key. None of this is accidental. The suppression and distortion of sexual energy serves a very specific purpose. Because a population addicted to shallow pleasure is easy to control. They are distracted. They are emotionally unstable. They are constantly chasing but never empowered. They fear being alone, yet they struggle to form meaningful connections. They fill the void with consumerism, entertainment, and external validation, all while the systems that profit from their disconnection grow stronger and more entrenched. When disconnected from sexual energy, one is not just disconnected from pleasure. They are disconnected from their own power, their own intuition, their own creativity. Sexual energy is not just about desire. It's about vitality, confidence, and life itself. When this energy flows freely, one feels alive, inspired, and in alignment with their higher self. But when it's suppressed or distorted, one becomes a hollow version of who they could be. Easier to direct, easier to exploit, easier to silence. The suppression of sacred sexuality is one of the most effective tools of mass control ever designed. It operates silently, invisibly, and most people never even realize it's happening. They internalize the shame, accept the narratives, and live their entire lives never knowing what they've been robbed of. And that is exactly how the system wants it. Because the moment this power is reclaimed, one becomes unpredictable. They stop needing products, institutions, distractions. They become centered, sovereign, and free. The truth is that sexual energy was never the enemy. It was never something to be feared, hidden, or bought. It was always a gateway, a path to awakening, to union, to the divine. And now that it has been seen how it was stolen, the only question that remains is, will one continue to play by their rules, or will they reclaim what was always theirs? Part 4. Kundalini and Collective Awakening. The Dormant Power. Kundalini hidden. Deep within the core of one's being lies a dormant power that most people will never activate, not because they can't, but because they've been programmed not to even know it exists. This power has been described in ancient traditions for thousands of years, yet remains mysteriously absent from modern teachings. It's called Kundalini, the coiled serpent energy resting at the base of the spine, waiting patiently for one to remember who they really are. The ancients understood that sexual energy and Kundalini are not separate forces, but one and the same. Sexual energy is the fuel that awakens Kundalini. And when that energy is properly directed, it doesn't just heighten physical pleasure. It launches one into entirely new realms of consciousness. The Kundalini energy is not symbolic. It's not a metaphor. It's a living, breathing, energetic force within. And when awakened, it begins its ascent through the chakras, the energy centers, unblocking, cleansing, and transforming the entire being. As it rises, it dissolves illusions, releases trauma, and burns away false identities that have been programmed since birth. The ultimate goal is union, not just with another person, but with the divine itself. This is what the mystics sought. This is what the mystery schools protected. This is why the system fears it so much. The transformative power and its risks. When Kundalini rises, reality is experienced in ways that most people cannot comprehend. The boundaries between self and other begin to blur. The linear nature of time collapses. Feelings of deep unity, unconditional love, and pure bliss wash over. It becomes clear that one is not separate from the cosmos. One is the cosmos experiencing itself through human form. In these moments, the illusions of control, fear, and separation crumble. And once that truth has been touched, one is never the same again. But this is precisely why such teachings have been buried. Because people who have experienced the full awakening of their Kundalini are not easily controlled. They see through the lies. They reject the manufactured fears. They don't need constant consumption to feel whole. They recognize their own sovereignty. And for the systems that thrive on compliance, that kind of sovereignty is dangerous. The process of awakening Kundalini is not without risks, which is another reason it's been hidden. In a world where people have been disconnected from their bodies, their emotions, and their true nature, attempting to force an awakening without proper preparation can lead to psychological and energetic imbalances. This isn't a game. The practices that safely awaken Kundalini require discipline, grounding, and deep inner work. That's why the ancient schools of Tantra, Daoism, and esoteric mystery traditions emphasize training, mentorship, and gradual progression. The power is real, and with real power comes real responsibility. Reclaiming energetic self. The tragedy is that rather than teaching people how to safely prepare for and navigate these awakenings, Modern society chose to simply suppress the knowledge altogether. It was deemed too dangerous, too disruptive, too uncontrollable. Instead of empowering individuals, they chose to infantilize them, and so generations grew up terrified of their own bodies, disconnected from their own energy, and completely oblivious to the dormant force that has always lived within them. When connection with this energy begins, even in small ways, the transformation is undeniable. One starts to feel more present, more alive, more attuned to the subtleties of their own emotions and desires. One begins to move through life with a confidence that isn't rooted in external validation, but in a deep, unshakable connection to their own source of power. Relationships becomes richer. Creativity flows effortlessly, and life takes on a new dimension of meaning. One no longer feels like they're endlessly searching for something outside of themselves, because they've found it inside. The system depends on this ignorance. As long as one remains disconnected from their own life force, they remain predictable. They stay addicted to the dopamine traps that have been set. They keep buying, consuming, scrolling, numbing, and conforming. But the moment even a fraction of Kundalini energy awakens, the script begins to break. One stops playing their game. One starts creating their own. And that's the ultimate secret that was never wanted to be known. Liberation was never going to come from outside. It was always inside. Waiting for one to remember. Waiting for one to rise. The illusion of separation shattered. From the moment one was born, they've been taught to see themselves as separate. From others, from nature, from the divine. This illusion of separation is the foundation upon which modern control systems are built. Because when one believes they are isolated, disconnected, and incomplete, they become easy to manipulate. They search for wholeness outside of themselves. In products, relationships, approval, and power. Never realizing that the very essence of what they seek has always lived within them. Nowhere is this illusion more profoundly shattered than in the experience of sacred sexual union, where the boundaries between self and other begin to dissolve, and a far deeper truth is momentarily glimpsed. At its highest expression, sexual union is not merely two bodies colliding, it is two energies merging. The masculine and feminine are not just gender roles, but universal polarities. Shiva and Shakti, yin and yang, active and receptive, consciousness and creation. In their merging, they mirror the original unity from which all existence was born. In that moment of deep connection, of full surrender, the illusion of separation collapses. One does not just touch another body, one touches the infinite through the vehicle of intimacy. The barriers between ego and soul thin, and for a brief instant, the very fabric of cosmic unity is experienced. This is why sexual energy has always been central to ancient mystical traditions. They understood that in the act of sacred union, we reenact the very act of creation itself. The same universal dance that birthed galaxies plays out within our own bodies, within our own hearts. And in those moments, time seems to disappear. The past, present, and future blur. One is not just themselves, they are everything, everywhere, all at once. The orgasm becomes not just a physical release, but a spiritual portal, a glimpse into the eternal. Why true intimacy is feared. Yet this is precisely the experience the system has worked so hard to strip away, because a person who understands this depth of connection becomes harder to divide, harder to control, harder to keep trapped in endless cycles of shallow pleasure and consumption. They no longer seek validation through external conquests or fleeting approval. They no longer buy into the myth that happiness lies in accumulation. They see the sacred in themselves and in others. And when enough people awaken to this truth, the entire foundation of the system begins to shake. This is why the media bombards with distorted images of what sex should be: casual, transactional, competitive. Why relationships are portrayed as constant power struggles. Why vulnerability is framed as weakness. Because true intimacy threatens the very structure that profits from disconnection. A population addicted to surface-level pleasure is easy to distract, but a population grounded in deep, sacred connection is dangerous. They cannot be divided by manufactured conflicts. They cannot be sold false versions of love. They see through the manipulation. The tragedy is that most people never even suspect what they've lost. They settle for hollow versions of connection, mistaking physical closeness for true union. They repeat the same patterns, chasing novelty while avoiding depth, fearing the vulnerability that real intimacy demands. But beneath the programming, the longing remains. A quiet ache for something more. A knowing that sex was meant to be something far greater than what has been sold. reclaiming the sacred. When one steps into sacred sexuality, they reclaim that which was stolen from them. They no longer chase pleasure for its own sake, but allow pleasure to become a gateway into transcendence. Every touch, every breath, every shared gaze becomes an act of devotion, not to the ego, but to the divine force that lives within both. This is not about performance, technique, or conquest. It is about presence, about fully inhabiting the body while simultaneously dissolving into something far beyond it. In these moments, it becomes clear why the ancients called sexual union a sacrament, why they guarded these teachings so fiercely. Because here, in this space beyond words, a truth is tasted that no system of control can offer. One experiences their own divinity, not as a concept, but as a living reality. And once that space has been touched, one is no longer theirs to manipulate. The system's power has always depended on disconnection, from self, from others, and from the divine. Sacred sexuality destroys that disconnection. It returns one to unity. It makes one whole. Part 5. Desire, Revolution, and the Path Forward. The weaponization of desire. Desire, in its purest form, is a force of creation. It's the spark that drives life forward, that fuels innovation, that births new worlds both within and around us. But like any powerful energy, desire can be manipulated, twisted, and weaponized. The system has long known that if it could hijack desires, it could control decisions, emotions, and ultimately, destiny. And there is no desire more potent, more deeply embedded in the human experience than sexual desire. What was once a sacred current of creative life force has been systematically inverted into one of the most effective control mechanisms ever designed. The distortion begins early, through subtle cues that condition one to associate desire with shame, guilt, and forbidden pleasure. One is taught to fear their own longings, to see them as dangerous, even sinful. This creates a perfect environment for control. One is pulled toward their desires by nature, yet pushed away from them by programming. The resulting tension leaves one vulnerable, always craving, never fully satisfied, constantly seeking external relief from an internal conflict barely understood. And into that vulnerability steps the system, ready to sell endless solutions that can never truly resolve the emptiness. The addiction economy. The advertising industry mastered this game long ago. They realized that by tapping into distorted sexual programming, they could create cravings that drive consumption. Sex sells not because it offers true fulfillment, but because it offers the illusion of fulfillment. Billboards, commercials, movies, and magazines bombard with carefully curated images, designed to trigger desire while ensuring that satisfaction remains always just out of reach. Beauty products are sold to make one more desirable, luxury items to signal worth, and endless entertainment to distract from the knowing sense that something is missing. But the void persists, because consumption can never replace connection. And then there's pornography, a tool of mass conditioning more powerful than most people dare to admit. It offers instant gratification without vulnerability, pleasure without intimacy, endless novelty without depth. Each click delivers a surge of dopamine, reinforcing a neural pathway that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. Over time, the brain rewires itself to associate sexual fulfillment with screens, fantasies, and artificial stimulation, rather than real human connection. The result is a growing inability to experience authentic intimacy. Real relationships begin to feel complicated, messy, even exhausting, compared to the instant simplicity of digital gratification. This isn't accidental. This is design. By trapping in cycles of unfulfilling pleasure, the system ensures that one remains distracted and dependent. A person addicted to surface-level stimulation is easier to pacify, less likely to question, and far more willing to conform. They stay busy chasing the next hit of pleasure, rarely stopping to consider the emptiness accumulating beneath the surface. And that emptiness becomes fertile ground for even more consumption. New products, new fantasies, new distractions, all feeding the same insatiable machine. The entertainment industry reinforces these patterns through its portrayal of relationships. Romance is reduced to shallow tropes of conquest, possession, and drama. Vulnerability is framed as weakness, and power dynamics are glorified as passion. The sacred dimension of sexuality is not just ignored, it's deliberately erased. Because if the profound depth of sacred union is never experienced, one won't realize what's missing. One will settle for substitutes, endlessly chasing fantasies that were never designed to nourish the soul. The collective revolution, But the consequences of this manipulation extend far beyond personal relationships. A society trapped in distorted desire is a society that can be easily controlled. Divide people against themselves, against each other, and collective unity is prevented. Keep them shrouded in shame and guilt, and they are prevented from forming deep, authentic bonds. Keep them trapped in cycles of consumption, and their constant distraction is ensured. But once those chains are broken, everything changes, because empowered individuals don't seek to dominate or compete. They seek to collaborate, to unite, to build something greater than themselves. And that kind of collective power threatens every institution built on fear, scarcity, and control. When people awaken to the sacred dimension of their sexual energy, they naturally begin to challenge every other area of programmed control. They question the media narratives that once kept them afraid. They see through the manufactured divisions of politics, race, class, and gender that have long been used to pit humanity against itself. They reject consumerism as the empty substitute it has always been. And most importantly, they begin to form new communities. Authentic, supportive networks, grounded in shared values, mutual respect, and deep connection. These communities don't depend on centralized systems of power. They operate through mutual empowerment, through wisdom sharing, through real intimacy. In these spaces, relationships evolve beyond transactional dynamics. Love is no longer conditional. Sexuality becomes an act of devotion, not performance. Communication deepens. Vulnerability is embraced, not weaponized. And from this foundation, creativity flourishes. Art, innovation, and healing emerge, not from competition, but from collaboration. The collective consciousness begins to rise, and with it, the ability to imagine entirely new ways of living, governing, and evolving as a species. This is not fantasy. This is potential. The reason it feels so radical is because it has been taught to believe it's impossible. The system has invested everything into convincing that human nature is inherently selfish, greedy, and disconnected. But this is a lie. Human nature, at its core, is driven by connection, by love, by the innate desire to return to wholeness. The systems of control have simply built structures that exploit disconnection for profit. But the moment enough people step out of those structures, the house of cards collapses. The collective revolution doesn't begin with marches or slogans. It begins quietly, internally, with each individual who dares to face their own conditioning and reclaim their sovereignty. It starts with a choice to see beyond the narratives fed since childhood, a choice to do the uncomfortable inner work of healing shame and breaking patterns, a choice to trust that what lies within is far more powerful than anything external systems could ever offer. As more individuals make that choice, the ripple effect grows. One person's awakening inspires another's. Conversations that were once taboo become normalized. Sacred sexuality is no longer whispered in secret circles, but openly celebrated as a path to spiritual expansion. And with each new voice added to the chorus, the old systems lose their grip. They can no longer hold back a population that sees through their tricks, that no longer needs their manufactured approval or validation. This is how true revolution happens. Not through force, but through mass remembrance, through millions of people returning to what was always theirs. Their bodies, their desires, their divinity. The system cannot survive a world where people are awake, connected, and aligned with their true essence. It depends on confusion, disconnection, obedience. But once power is reclaimed, one becomes impossible to govern. In the old ways, one becomes the living proof that freedom is not something granted by external forces. It's something reclaimed from within. The truth has always been simple, even if it has been tirelessly complicated. Your sexual energy is not the enemy. It was never meant to be feared, controlled, or sold back in broken, fragmented pieces. It is life force, creative essence, a direct connection to something far larger than oneself. And for too long, there has been conditioning to hand that power away, to systems that thrive on disconnection, to narratives designed to keep one small, to industries that profit from emptiness. But now it is seen, it is felt, and it can no longer be unseen. The moment this truth awakens, the grip of the system begins to weaken. It becomes clear that freedom was never something to be given or taken. It was something that existed within all along. The systems that try to control relied entirely on belief in their power. Once one's own is reclaimed, Their hold fades into irrelevance, because a sovereign individual, someone deeply connected to their own sacred energy, is the one thing these structures cannot control. Reclaiming sexual spiritual energy is not about reaching some perfect state of enlightenment where desire disappears. It's about integrating all parts of oneself, welcoming humanity fully, while elevating it into conscious expression. It's about learning to feel deeply, love openly, and connect authentically, without falling into the traps of guilt, shame, or programmed scripts. It's about turning every intimate encounter, with oneself or another, into a sacred act of devotion, a living meditation on the unity of all things. As this new way of being is stepped into, it becomes easy to see through the noise that once blinded. The hollow promises of consumerism no longer seduce. The manufactured conflicts meant to divide seem absurd. The need for constant validation begins to fade, replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence rooted in one's own alignment. Empty pleasures are no longer chased to fill a void that was never truly empty. Connection is reestablished with the source that was simply waiting to be remembered. This is how one becomes dangerous to the system, not because one is violent or rebellious in the way they want one to believe, but because one no longer needs what they offer. One becomes whole. And a population of whole, sovereign, awake individuals is a population that will naturally birth new systems. Systems not based on control and fear, but on connection, truth, and authentic spiritual growth. The shift begins with the individual, but it doesn't end there. Courage to awaken inspires others. Authenticity invites them to question their own programming. And slowly, one conversation at a time, one healing at a time, one sacred union at a time, the collective consciousness rises. The revolution is not loud at first. It's subtle, personal, and unstoppable. Two paths have been offered throughout life: compliance or freedom. The system dressed compliance up as safety, as normalcy, as virtue. But freedom, real freedom, was always risky, uncomfortable, and inconvenient, because it requires breaking from the herd. Yet it's only on that path that the fullness of who one is found. It's where desires are reclaimed, not as burdens, but as sacred tools. It's where intimacy is experienced, not as performance, but as communion. It's where it's discovered that what was told to be feared was the very doorway to awakening. And if that path is chosen, one is not alone. Others are already walking it, breaking free from the narratives, shedding the shame, and stepping into a depth of connection that cannot be described, only experienced. Together, this rising tide becomes impossible to ignore. The old structures will try to adapt, to distract, to pull back into the comfortable numbness of conformity. But once one's own sovereignty has been felt, that pull loses its grip. The choice has already been made. This journey taken together is just the beginning. There are layers of hidden wisdom that go far deeper than what can be safely discussed here. That's why the Insights Academy newsletter was created, a private space where these forbidden teachings are explored without the restrictions of public platforms. And while it's available, a free digital copy of Glyphori, the Kabbalion, will still be received when joining. The link is in the description. But understand, every moment of delay is a moment the system continues to win. If this video resonated, let us know by commenting. I understood it.